Hey guys, this is Mr. Sisson, and we're going to do a workshop where we build our own progressive era timelines. And the goal of this, before we start really digging into our documents, our progressive documents, is that we'll be able to have some context for everything, know when people lived, when certain documents were written, or when speeches were spoken. And this timeline is going to help us figure that out. So the first thing that I want us to do is to get our paper to look like mine. And so don't worry about this stuff up here because we'll talk about that after, but I do want you to write your title at the top, Progressive Era Timeline. And then I want you to build your timeline to go from 1880 all the way up to 1920. And 1900 is going to be right in the middle. And then I want you to build your key up here. And hopefully you've got some different colors to work with this, but if you don't, we'll see what we can get figured out there. But what I did is I have green for business regulation, yellow for women's rights, blue for prohibition, orange for racial equality, and pink for immigration. And these are the main issues that we're going to deal with whenever we talk about the progressive movement. So, if you will, just pause your video and go ahead and make sure your paper looks like mine. All right. So, first off, whenever we talk about progressivism or the progressive movement, what we're talking about is a group of people or a movement that decided that in order to right wrongs in society, they would use the government. You could almost look at the government like Hobbes would talk about. Like the government's the big power, and we're going to fix things by appealing to the big power. Or like if your brother is messing with you, you go get your parents. And so in a lot of ways, that's what the progressive movement sought to do. And so you see government get a lot bigger, but you also do see a lot of wrongs get righted in the progressive movement. So we're going to look through those. One of the first thing we're going to talk about is business regulation. And whenever we say regulation, really what we're talking about is just rules. And so you could look at business regulation as rules for business. And there were a couple different ways that people sought to have rules put on business in this time period. And one is in regards to the public. So how do businesses treat the public? You, me, your parents, Mr. Lou. That's the public at large. That's the people. But other rules were put on businesses to help how they treated workers. How did they treat the people that worked for them? And going into this time period, and we're going to spend some more time talking about this later, there had been a huge boom in business from the end of the Civil War to 1880, and it really kept going. But there were businesses that had gotten bigger and bigger and more powerful, which meant that business owners had become more and more powerful. And so whenever you hear people talk about Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, who owned Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie, who owned U.S. Steel, Cornelius Vanderbilt owned a ton of railroads, J.P. Morgan owned a little bit of everything. These were all guys that were so powerful. I think Vanderbilt, they say, I'm kind of going blind here, but I think that they said Vanderbilt at one point, if you would have taken $20 out of the country, every $1.20 would have been Vanderbilt's. And so that means he was 1/20th of the whole economy. And I think they say Bill Gates right now is like 1/90th or something like that. Like Vanderbilt is just so rich. But the scary thing at this time, and what you see a lot of people talk about, were monopolies and trusts. They're the same thing. It's when one company owns a whole lot, or owns basically all of an industry, owns everything there. And so it'd be like if Apple produced all smartphones. There were no Samsung, no anything like that. That would be a monopoly. And people were really worried about these because with monopolies meant that those companies had a whole lot of power over the public and over the government and things like that. So we saw a whole lot with this that hopefully we'll be able to put into some context for us. So one of the first documents that we looked at was Cleveland's veto of the Texas Seed Bill. And this was in about 1887, I think is what I had. So I'm going to put in 1890 here just so we can stay clear. Okay. So 1887. And this is Cleveland's veto of the Texas Seed Bill. So at this time, Cleveland was the president of the United States, and he had an appeal to him, and the government had signed off on it, or the House of Representatives, the Senate, and everything, to send some seeds to some farmers in Texas that had a drought. And Cleveland basically said at this point, hey, you know what? I know that if the government paid for you guys to have some seeds, that would probably help with your suffering, but that's not the job of the government. Well, now we could look at that and say, oh, man, Cleveland, gosh, that guy he was pretty rough. But really, that was kind of the tone at this point. And so monopolies had grown so fast, and the country was saying, well, okay, so we're supposed to be free. We're supposed to let people, live out their dreams, an American dream and freedom. And really, is it the government's job to step in and tell these people how to run their businesses? So what I like about this is really going to be the first time where, in the documents we've looked at, where they're addressing this question, like, well, what do we do with this? How do we handle monopolies? How do we interfere with business, or is that our job at all? And Cleveland said it is not the government's job to interfere with monopolies. Well, just a few years later, there was something passed called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is in 1890. And remember, we said trust is just a different word for monopoly. So really, you could read this like the Sherman Anti-Monopoly Act. And this act was really the first piece of legislation that had some teeth in it to kind of break up big businesses, the Standard Oils, the U.S. Steels, and everything like that. But it wasn't really emphasized for a long time. So it was put into effect, but people couldn't really make it, didn't really use it. And so businesses still kind of ran free. Really, you don't start seeing the Sherman Antitrust Act start getting used until Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, which we could look at here in a little bit. And then one of the other documents that we've looked at was in 1894. And you guys may remember this, but this is President Cleveland remembering the Pullman Railroad Workers strike. Really, they just say the Pullman Strike. It's probably, but the Pullman company made rail cars. And at this point, I think they made something like 3/4 out of every car that was on the rails. Well, this was a big deal because what happened is when those workers went on strike and basically said, that's it, we're not working anymore, because they wanted higher wages, they wanted better treatment, it shut down the basically shut down the Pullman factory, but it did more than that because the whole Railway Workers Union said, we won't even haul Pullman cars anymore. Meaning it would be like if today Ford workers went on strike and all gas stations were part of it and said, that's it, we're not filling any Ford cars anymore. Well, Ford would really be running into some problems. And what we see here, I do want to talk about this before I forget, is Eugene V Debs. It's one of the first places where you see him pop on the scene. He was the Railway Workers Union president. So you see him really show up at this point. But what happens is the Pullman strike spills over to the whole railroad industry. And so the railroads basically stop running. And why that's a big deal is because it's not just those companies that use the railroad, because people have to use those railroads. And not only just people, but the government needed those railroads. The government was had their U.S. mail contract through there. Does that look like an envelope, kind of? It looks like a face. But maybe I should say envelope. I'll say mail. But the Pullman strike meant that now the government can't deliver mail. And so, in effect, you had workers from a private company that basically shut down the country. And this was a big deal. And this kind of woke people up to the power of the railroads. Not if they didn't already know, they realized that whoever owns the railroads basically runs the country. Well, who owned the railroads? Guys like Vanderbilt. And Rockefeller had a huge pull in the railroads. These sorts of guys, all of a sudden people are saying they have more power than the government. And so this was a real fear. This is where monopoly or companies like this start to have a lot of say. And so that's why it was such a problem. Well, we can fast forward a little bit more to another document, and this was in 1902, and this is our Ida Tarbell, or with that D capitalized, piece against Standard Oil. And this was a series of articles she wrote against Standard Oil in McClure's magazine. What Ida Tarbell was called was a muckraker. And what that meant is she was not just a reporter who would talk about sports or something like that, but she would dig into the things that no one else knew about. Nowadays they would call it investigative journalism. But Ida Tarbell dug into the business practices of Standard Oil, how Standard Oil had a whole system of rebates and payment that basically put independent oil producers at a disadvantage, and so they were shutting down the little man. And so this all of a sudden made people realize, if Standard Oil keeps doing this, they're going to keep getting bigger and bigger, which means that no other companies could even break into the oil market, which meant that the monopoly of Standard Oil is going to become stronger and stronger and stronger. And so this was a real eye-opening moment. And the muckraking movement went on for a little while, from basically 1900 to, 1908, 1910-ish, where they exposed wrongs that businesses were doing. And so specifically here, she was talking about in regards to the public. But what we're going to see is another guy. I'm going to go ahead and put in 1910 here so I can have a reference point. In 1906, another muckraker was a guy named Upton Sinclair. And the way that Ida Tarbell dug into Standard Oil, Upton Sinclair, I guess he didn't publish The Jungle, but he wrote it. Upton Sinclair dug into the meatpacking industry in Chicago. I'm going to try and draw this, but I didn't do a good job earlier. Oh, that's not bad. I'm really focusing on this. Does that kind of look like a bull, maybe? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. And this is where we read that document about rats and rat poison, all of it getting pushed into meat, sausage stuff that would all be mixing the same thing. So this is really horrible, horrific stuff. Theodore Roosevelt read this book, and what it led to was the formation of the FDA. And the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, and that kind of branched off from some legislation that passed. But this all came in 1906. If you ever wonder about the FDA, what it does, I'm going to draw a toothbrush. If you ever have an FDA-approved toothbrush, they make sure food is healthy. They're inspecting that stuff. They make sure medicine, not medicine, but like toiletries, toothpaste, all that stuff the FDA looks into. Maybe they do medicine too, but I'm not sure. But this was some real change that came out of Upton Sinclair publishing The Jungle. So this was, and we looked at it in regards to the public, but it also was in regards to workers' rights, because if we read more of that book, one thing that we would find is that the workers in those meatpacking plants were really treated horribly too. And then in 1911, this is probably one of the harder documents we had to read, we had the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This is a triangle kind of on fire. I'm just going to say Triangle Fire. And what this did, remember that we haven't got a chance to talk about it really, but the doors of the Triangle Factory were locked because they didn't want unionizers to get in and get those women to unionize. Well, those women probably would have been upset about working conditions, and they had gone on strike earlier before. But in 1911, unsafe working conditions lead to this factory fire where over 100 women die, 100 people die. And this led to more it kind of woke people up to the dangers of unregulated business. If there are no rules, you don't have to pay your employees this much, you don't need to make sure that working conditions are this nice, then this is what happens. People don't necessarily value life, they value the profit. So the triangle fire happened there. And what we found is basically by the end of this decade, you started seeing things like child labor laws passed by Woodrow Wilson, and you start seeing some of those laws go into effect that today hopefully make for the modern, safe workplace. All right, so next we're going to look at Prohibition. Remember, Prohibition was the 18th Amendment that ends up making alcohol or the sale of alcohol illegal in this country. In a lot of ways, I would say this is where progressivism went wrong. Because if you go back for the rest of time, go back into the 1800s and or early 1800s, alcohol was a serious problem. Like women and kids were starving because their husbands would go off and spend all their money at the saloon, and it was a really big problem. But nobody really knew how to. It was so ingrained in our society, no one really knew how to get rid of it. And I just want to look at a couple dates, and we'll learn more about these as we go. But in 1893, there was a organization called the Antisaloon League. And why that's important is because this is Wayne B. Wheeler's organization. And the Antisaloon League basically said, hey, if you're a candidate running for office and you're in favor of alcohol, we're going to make sure that all our people don't vote for you. And why that's important, and this is one thing that gets lost with Prohibition, is that basically everybody was for it. It didn't matter if you're a liberal or conservative or communist or the Ku Klux Klan or there were all sorts of people that were in favor of Prohibition. And so if the Anti-Saloon League said, we're not endorsing you for your candidacy, then basically that means you're not getting elected. So Wayne B. Wheeler was, his organization formed in 1893. And Prohibition, the amendment, was the 18th Amendment, and it passed, I'm going to go right up here, in 1919, which made alcohol illegal. And for what it's worth, for that to become an amendment means that 3/4 of the states had to say, this is a great idea, we agree with it. And so it meant everybody was on board for Prohibition. And so it passed in 1919. It lasts all the way up to 1933, so all the way into the Great Depression. Let's take a look real quick at racial equality. So racial equality, we have a couple different documents on that. And one is by W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois, basically, he forms the NAACP in 1909. And that's really what we know him for. That's kind of his lasting thing. And he's really memorable. And we even... like the way that he sought to bring about change or equality would fit in with a lot of the people that we even think about when we think civil rights. So the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And Du Bois, if you read his writing, he says one of the biggest things that they need to do is agitate. And what that means is stir the pot. And Frederick Douglass is someone that we've talked a little bit about too. And they say that Frederick Douglass's last words were agitate, agitate, agitate. Basically, stir the pot until we find equality. And so that was Du Bois in 1909. The other guy that we talk about when we talk about racial equality was Booker T. Washington. And he formed the Tuskegee Institute way back here. And this is he was an educator at first. He formed it back in 1881. And the Tuskegee Institute was basically like a university for African Americans. And Booker T. Washington, he may have wanted the exact same things as Du Bois, but he thought there were different ways to get there. And so instead of just stirring the pot, Booker T. Washington would have said, hey, be productive members of society. Work hard. Be tailors and blacksmiths and work in factories and show ourselves to be upstanding members of society. And that way, white people will respect us and will find equality. And so Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, both want equality, both want the same things, but have very different ideas on how to get there. Then we're going to look at one more, and this is immigration. And immigration, just so we can have a picture, in 1880, basically from 1880 all the way up to 1930, there were 25 million immigrants that came from places like Russia, Italy, Poland, Greece. All these people coming from these countries that were Southern Europe or Eastern Europe. And whenever we read the people like Henry Cabot Lodge that wrote in 1909? 1908, I think. Henry Cabot Lodge's speech, the reason they were so concerned about immigration was because 25 million immigrants in this time period coming from countries that were different from the English, British, whatever, French, even Irish ancestry that had been this country. Well, when we go back here, there were 25 million immigrants that came at this point. At this point in time, the whole population of America was only about 50 million. So it means you have about half as many people coming over this time period who speak different languages, things like that. And so the one other thing I want to put in here is Teddy Roosevelt's speech, which is going to be, where was that? 1916. Where was that? Here we go. TR's speech. But he said he believes in America for Americans, meaning you have to want to be here. And he said he was up against all hyphenated Americans. And I want us to realize right before we stop that what he's saying is if we have 25 million people coming, our country's doubling by 50%, and all of them are saying, well, I'm Greek American, I'm Italian American, I'm Polish American, then all of a sudden, who are going to be the Americans? And so his America for Americans was confronting that problem. America for Americans. Okay, so all of these issues we're going to dive a little bit deeper into, but this is them, and this is your context. If you need to look at any of this stuff, you could pause the video along here. I'm just going to run this along, and hopefully you can pause the video and get caught up wherever you need to. All right, thanks, guys. Looking forward to diving into this stuff. See ya.